Mara asked me a question tonight that nobody's asked me in 3 years, and I think she deserves the real answer instead of the short one I usually give. She said, "Why doesn't your family ever come up? Not once. Not your mom, not your dad, not even your sister." And she said it gently, the way you ask something you've been sitting on for a while, waiting for the right moment. I put my coffee down. I looked at her for a second longer than I needed to, because I was deciding whether tonight was the night. It is. So let me tell you why there's an empty chair where my family used to sit, and why I'm the one who put it there. You know me as steady. You've said that about me more than once, that I don't rattle, that I read a room before I ever open my mouth. What you don't know is where that came from. It didn't come from 22 years in the army. It came from a dinner table in a small house in Ohio, where I learned early that being steady was the only way to survive being invisible. I'm not going to make this longer than it needs to be, but I'm going to tell you all of it, because you asked, and because I think some part of me has been waiting 3 years for someone to ask. So here we go, from the beginning. I was the second child. My sister Vanessa came first, and from what I can tell, she came first in everything after that too. She was sharp, she was funny in that way that made adults laugh even when what she said wasn't kind, and she figured out early that our parents responded to confidence more than they responded to truth. I figured that out too. I just didn't have it in me to fake the confidence, so I went a different direction. I got quiet, I got useful, and I got out as soon as I legally could. I enlisted at 18. My father shook my hand at the bus station like I was leaving for a summer job. My mother cried, but it wasn't the kind of crying that says I'm proud of you. It was the kind that says who's going to help me with your sister's move now. Vanessa was starting her first sales job that same month, and somehow that got the bigger conversation at dinner for the next 2 years. I'd call home from basic training and hear about her commission structure. I'd come home on leave and hear about her new apartment, her new boyfriend, her promotion. Nobody asked what I did. Nobody asked if I was safe. I stopped expecting them to. I want to be fair here, because fair matters to me, even now, even after everything. My parents weren't cruel people in the dramatic sense. They didn't scream, they didn't throw things. They just allocated their attention like a limited resource, and Vanessa always got the bigger share because Vanessa knew how to ask for it, and I never learned to. Every family has a currency. In ours, it was being impressive out loud. I was doing things that mattered. I just didn't know how to sell them at a dinner table, and Vanessa could sell anything, including herself. By the time I made staff sergeant, then went on to become a warrant officer, then finished my degree between deployments, my family story about me had already calcified. Daniel's in the army. Bless him, he never really figured out what he wanted to do. That sentence followed me home every single time. It didn't matter what I'd actually accomplished. It didn't matter that I'd led people through things that would break most civilians in half. In that house, my whole career translated to one soft, dismissive sentence, usually delivered right before the conversation turned back to Vanessa. Vanessa, meanwhile, had become something my parents loved to describe as a rising star. She'd moved from sales into business development for a mid-sized government contracting firm, the kind that does logistics and supply work for federal agencies. She talked in acronyms she barely understood and dropped names of executives she'd met once at a conference. My parents ate it up. Every holiday, she had a new story about a deal she'd closed, a client she'd charmed, a bonus she'd earned. I never once heard anyone ask her to explain the numbers. I noticed that. I kept noticing things. That was always my whole skill set, long before it became my job. I retired from active duty 8 years ago, at 41, with a bad knee and a chest full of things I don't talk about even with you yet. And here's the part that still sits strange in my stomach. My family treated my retirement like a period at the end of a sentence nobody had bothered reading. So what now? My mother asked me, like I'd just wasted 2 decades instead of spent them. I didn't tell her what now was. I'd already been recruited into federal work before I ever took off the uniform. A quiet transition, the kind you don't advertise at Thanksgiving. I let them believe whatever they wanted to believe. It was easier than correcting them, and some small, tired part of me had stopped caring whether they understood. That's the world I came from into that last Thanksgiving. A house where my sister's word was gospel and my career was a punchline nobody bothered finishing. I want you to hold on to that picture because it matters for what comes next, and because you asked me why I don't go home, and the honest answer is, I stopped being welcome there long before I stopped showing up. Here's where it starts to turn, And I promise you, I didn't see it coming the way you'd think. About 2 years before that Thanksgiving, I'd been folded into a task force, interagency work, the kind where 3 or 4 different offices share information they'd normally guard jealously, because the case is bigger than any one of them. I can't give you every detail even now, but I can tell you the shape of it. We were looking at a contracting firm suspected of inflating invoices and steering subcontracts to shell companies that didn't do the work they were paid for. Federal money, moving in circles that weren't supposed to exist. It was slow work. Documents, bank records, shipping manifests that didn't match delivery logs. The kind of case that takes a year to build and 5 minutes to explain once it's built. I want to be honest with you. For the first several months, I had no idea my sister's company was anywhere near it. It's a big industry. There are a lot of firms doing that kind of work, and Vanessa had changed jobs twice since the last time I'd actually paid attention to her career instead of just nodding along at dinner. It wasn't until her name came up, not as a target, just as a contact listed on a vendor email chain, that something in my chest went cold and still, the way it used to right before a briefing I already knew was bad news. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't say anything to my parents. I want you to understand why, because I know it sounds strange from the outside. I kept my own family at arm's length from my own suspicions, because that's the job, and because some tired, guarded part of me had already learned not to hand my family anything they could turn into a story about me. I just watched. I kept my own private ledger, the way I always had, not on paper, just in my head, of every strange thing that didn't add up. A vendor that didn't exist at the address on file. A shipment logged as delivered a week before the truck ever left the warehouse. Vanessa's name, appearing more than once, always adjacent to numbers that were bigger than her actual job title should have touched. That Thanksgiving, Mara, I almost didn't go. I told myself I was tired, that the drive wasn't worth it, that I could see my parents at Christmas instead. But something made me go. Maybe I wanted to see her face one more time before I knew for certain what I already suspected. Maybe some old, worn-down part of me still wanted to be wrong. The frame flickers here. Mara shifts on the couch, and I can feel her waiting, the way she does when she already senses the shape of where a story's going but won't interrupt it. I look at her, and I say, I'm getting there. Just, let me get there the way it happened. So I drove the 4 hours out to my parents' house with a duffel bag and about a year's worth of quiet dread, and I told myself, whatever happens today, I already know who I am. Nobody in that house gets to take that from me again. I didn't know yet how right I'd need that thought to be by the end of the night. The house smelled like it always did on Thanksgiving. Turkey and my mother's box stuffing and the particular tension of people who love each other in theory more than in practice. My father hugged me the way he always did, a firm clap on the back, already looking past my shoulder toward the driveway for Vanessa's car. She arrived 20 minutes later, and she didn't arrive alone. She had a man with her, mid-50s, expensive watch, the kind of practiced smile that comes from a career of closing rooms instead of just deals. My mother introduced him before Vanessa even got her coat off. Richard Voss, business associate, my sister said, though the way she said it made it clear she wanted this dinner to be an audition. She wanted my parents, and clearly, this man, to see her as important. And to be fair to her, for one evening, she'd built exactly the stage she wanted. I recognized the name the second I heard it. Richard Voss. I'd seen it in the case file 3 weeks earlier, flagged not as a suspect, but as something rarer and more useful. A cooperating witness. A man who'd started talking to federal investigators 8 months prior after his own business partner tried to cut him out of a settlement. He didn't know me. He'd never seen my face outside of a conference room 3 states away, in a suit, under a different context entirely. Here, I was just Daniel, the brother nobody had bothered explaining. I kept my ledger running the whole dinner, quiet, invisible, the way I always had at that table. Vanessa performed. She always performed. She told Voss about her portfolio of federal accounts like she was reciting a resume for a stranger. My parents beamed at her the entire time, nodding at numbers I already knew were inflated, because I'd read the real ones. And then, somewhere around the pumpkin pie, she turned to me, the way people do when they need a punchline to make themselves look bigger by comparison. And this is my brother, she said, gesturing at me with her wine glass, already smiling before the joke even landed. Retired Army. Very humble life now. Aren't you, Danny? Still figuring out what's next? My parents laughed. Actually laughed, warm and easy, the kind of laugh that comes from years of practice. Washed up nobody, she added, not even unkindly. Just careless, the way you'd flick a crumb off a tablecloth. She said it right to Voss, like she was letting him in on a family joke, like she needed him to see that whatever I was, she was the opposite of it. I didn't answer. I want you to know that. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct her. I didn't even let my face change. I'd had a lot of practice not reacting in rooms far more dangerous than that dining room. And some quiet, tired part of me had simply stopped needing that table's approval years earlier. I just looked at Voss for half a second longer than I looked at anyone else at that table, and something in his face, a flicker, a recalculation, told me he'd clocked something I hadn't said out loud. 3 weeks later, the case closed its final loop. The financial records had already told most of the truth by then. The shell vendors, the phantom deliveries, the numbers that only worked if nobody ever asked a second question. Voss's cooperation filled in the rest, including something I hadn't expected, a set of internal emails where my sister wasn't a bystander at all. She'd been the one signing off on 3 of the fraudulent vendor approvals herself, chasing a bonus tied to contract volume, not asking, or not caring, where the volume was actually coming from. I want to be precise about something, because it matters to me that you understand this part correctly. I wasn't the one who arrested her. I want that on the record between us. I was recused from that portion the moment her name surfaced formally, exactly the way procedure requires, exactly the way it should. But I was in the room, 3 days later, when the case agent briefed the arrest team, and I watched federal agents pull up to my parents' street on a gray Tuesday morning with paperwork that had my sister's signature on 3 separate fraudulent authorizations. They knocked on the door. My mother answered it in her bathrobe. And for the first time in my entire life, the whole family finally had to sit at a table and listen to someone else's version of who Vanessa really was. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing when I heard how it went. I felt something. I'm just not sure satisfaction is the right word for it. It was quieter than that, and heavier. Vanessa took a plea eventually. Restitution, probation, the kind of professional consequence that follows you for the rest of your working life, whether or not you ever see a cell. My parents called me exactly once after it happened, and the first thing my mother said wasn't "Are you okay?" or even "Did you know?" It was "How could you let this happen to your sister?" I remember standing in my kitchen, phone against my ear, and realizing with a strange, still calm that I finally had my answer to a question I'd been asking my whole life. I hadn't let anything happen to Vanessa. Vanessa had built the whole thing herself, one signature at a time, and I was simply the only person in that family who'd ever bothered to actually look. I told my mother, calmly, that I hadn't been part of the arrest, that I'd been recused the moment it mattered, and that none of this was about me at all. She didn't want to hear that. She wanted a villain that wasn't her favorite child, and for 39 years, I'd been an easy one to point at. I told her I loved her. I told her I wasn't angry. And then I told her I wouldn't be coming to Christmas, and I haven't been back since. My father and I talk maybe twice a year now. Careful, surface-level calls that don't go anywhere near any of this. Vanessa and I haven't spoken at all. I don't carry that like an open wound anymore. It settled a long time ago into something quieter, something closer to peace than grief. I built a life that doesn't need that table's approval to feel steady. I built you, in this apartment, and a career I'm finally allowed to be quietly proud of instead of publicly dismissed for. So that's the answer to your question, Mara. That's why the chair's empty at every holiday, and why it's going to stay that way. Not out of anger. Out of choice. Mine, finally, after 39 years of not having one. I look at you now, across this kitchen, and I need you to hear this part directly. Not as a story anymore, but as something true I'm telling you. Right here, tonight. I stopped needing that family's version of me a long time ago. I only need yours. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever been the nobody in a room that couldn't see what you were quietly carrying, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from.